Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour, brought to you by Effective Artistry. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I'm joined as ever by Brandon Tessers, LCPC and Clinical Director of Effective Artistry. A little bit about EF coaching and therapy. Effective Artistry is a neurodiversity affirming a therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois, taking on therapy clients anywhere in the state of Illinois. There are also some executive functioning coaches who work in association with Effective Artistry, like myself, and we can meet with you anywhere you are in the world as long as you have an internet connection. So good to be with you, Brandon. How are you doing?
With you, Marie. I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. I did not sleep last night. I had a very sleepless night.
Oh, yeah?
And then I ended up sleeping most of today. So I've only been up for a few hours, but I've still been productive.
Like 7 p.m. your time right now?
It's 7 p.m. my time. So I got to sleep at 7 a.m. So sleep is something that we know is an ongoing issue for a lot of neurodivergent people and ADHDers.
A lot of overlap in the Venn diagram, yeah.
Yeah.
I also, my oldest son was up a few times in the night, sick, so I'm running on low sleep right now. But
yeah,
it's nice to be back. I'm glad. Yeah. I always hate having to cancel, and then last Monday I just didn't have much of a voice, but I'm feeling better now. And sorry to anybody who was here. That's twice now in the past few months. Before these last couple months, I think we've canceled 3 times in 2023, and prior to that, I'd only canceled it twice, I think, in the previous couple of years. So hopefully that won't happen as much. Just practice is growing, and other things are taking more time, and health has been an issue. But I'm glad to be here now.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be back as well. I wasn't available last week either because I had to work. So, but yeah, you have, in fairness, been pretty consistent with this stream for a couple of years now. So
there's some notable ones. There was one I did entirely on the phone because I couldn't get. I was at the lake house with my family, my in-laws' lake house for a week, and couldn't get the internet going. That was a fun one. But yeah, we try and keep it consistent. I hate disappointing people, like many neurodivergent people.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've got my tea. You've got your tea.
Yeah.
I've got my my latest fidget toy, which is some very pretty fidget putty, which I'm really enjoying at the moment. It's got all these lovely, pretty purple and green colors. So if I look away from the screen today, it's because I'm distracted by the pretty colors. But I'll try not to get too distracted. So we have a good topic today that was brought to us by Sarah Geitz, one of the coaches with Effective Artistry, and it's something that comes up a lot on social media as well. But Sarah mentioned it's something that has been coming up a lot for her in coaching with clients, which is the question of accommodations. And it's a really big topic. So requesting accommodations, disability adjustments, things like that. And it's different whether you're in the workplace or in education. So I thought we might break it down over 2 weeks and focus on workplace accommodations today, because there might be some differences between securing accommodations in work versus school or college.
Sure.
If that sounds good to you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So we have a few questions. I think we have one kind of a long question, which we might go into in a little bit more detail later on. But I'll start by asking you, because I know you give talks to employers and businesses about this and about neurodiversity. So my question for you, Brandon, is what do you see as the biggest challenge for disabled and or neurodivergent employees when they're trying to secure accommodations?
Well, so there's a bunch of potential answers. So let's clarify a couple of things. You know how I like to try to narrow the constraints. Otherwise, it's so one thing that's important is accommodations there are official accommodations which have official processes that you need to go through those channels in order to get those. And then there are unofficial accommodations, because this word is a word that we can use just colloquially, right? Like if I honestly, this, I don't want to like diminish the idea of accommodations, but a person could validly say that having access to their morning coffee is a workplace accommodation, right? Accommodation just means there's a thing I am trying to do that is either not possible or very difficult or whatever. It either, if I am able to be accommodated in a certain way, have access to a particular tool or resource or system or information, then it will take something that wasn't possible for me and make it possible, or it will take something and make it much more efficient, easier, less costly for me to be able to do or to access. When it comes to the workplace, there's really not a lot of official stuff. And I'll also clarify that I don't know anything about laws outside of the United States. So anything I'm talking about, just so that I don't have to give the caveat over and over as we talk about this, I'm going to reference laws and things like that. I'm talking about the United States because that's the only one I know. I don't know in what ways the UK is the same and in what ways it's different, or Canada or India or anywhere in the world. So there's very little in terms of legal requirements for employers in terms of providing accommodations. The big guideline for this is what's called the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1991, which is a important pivotal piece of legislation, changed a lot of things, but also flawed and limited, like all things are. Basically, for each individual person, it comes down to what the ADA requires is that people provide all reasonable accommodations to guarantee equitable access. Now, reasonable is a debatable thing. And one of the big problems with the structure of the ADA is that it is on the person who is requesting and being denied an accommodation to sue and take it through the legal system. And when it's a big company that has all kinds of lawyers and all kinds of time and all kinds of money, and you're just a person, it's very hard to go through that process. So I'm going through all this to say, to me, that's the biggest thing, is that when it comes to the workplace, you have very little recourse. If you are denied an accommodation that you're requesting, there's very little you can do legally. You can sue, but it's a long process, it's debatable, it's expensive, and generally speaking, your employer is going to have more resources at their disposal than you do at yours. Which then takes all this and kind of puts it in the realm of, how do I get my employer to be willing to give these accommodations? Because if they say no and I think it's reasonable, it's just not a very viable way for most people to go. Of course, if you do end up having to deal with something like that, I would suggest getting in contact with organizations that can support you, whether that's the ACLU or, but a particular association associated with whatever your particular disability is. Don't try and do this stuff alone, just like with everything. It's all community-based.
Yeah.
Say that all at the beginning because it's not very practical, and we're not going to talk much about that as we go on. We're going to talk about the more useful, like how to go about discussing this. But to me, that is the biggest accommodation, or the biggest problem is this fear that if I ask and they say no, there's nothing I can really do about it. And so then, especially neurodivergent people will often not want to ask until they feel as though I know exactly how to ask, and I know that they'll say yes. Because if I ask too early and they say no, then I feel like I can't come back and ask again later when things have changed. Whereas if I wait until I feel like, oh, now they like me enough or feel as though they owe me enough or whatever, so they're trying not to jump the gun. But that also makes it much more difficult to get to a place in your relationship with your employer where everything's smooth and going well, because you're trying to hide some stuff from them that you don't want them to know.
Yeah.
It's that part, revealing it, talking about it when you're worried about the stigma, you're worried about how they might react.
Yeah, so this was another question, actually. Some employees would be reluctant to disclose a hidden disability or condition in case they may face discrimination or lose promotion prospects. So are there ways then to ask for accommodations without having to disclose you feel like discrimination could be an issue for you, and you're not in a position to leave your place of employment and go somewhere where you might feel more secure?
Right. So unlike when we talk about schools, where there is still some like individual different districts and different states operate in different ways, there's a lot more universal process. With workplace accommodations, it's literally entirely up to your particular workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So it always, the answer is going to be, it depends, right? Like, is there anything I can do, or what's the best way to, is always just going to be depends. If you have a company that has an HR department, which, you know, any company in the United States of a certain size or larger is required to have someone available for that kind of thing, then start by going to HR, because HR does, they are required to have some processes by which you are able to talk about things with them confidentially that aren't like revealed to your bosses. So you approach HR and tell them that there's something you want to discuss, but that you want to be able to talk through it without having to worry about whether your boss might find out about it, that it's a personal issue, and et cetera, et cetera. And then it just kind of depends from there, not only on like how your company's processes are set up, but also sometimes on the individual HR person.
Yeah.
Because some of these things, see, when we talk, that's why I want to clarify accommodation, what that word means. Because when we're talking about these official requested accommodations, the ones that are like mandated by the ADA, then organizations provide those things because they have to, in order to avoid being held legally liable for violating the law.
Yeah.
And there are things that are difficult to prove. Like, how do you prove theoretically that you were passed over for a promotion because you revealed that you have ADHD, for example?
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of like official and not unofficial back channels and leeway and whatever. But start with HR. Of course, I would hope, when I talk to companies, I'm mostly focused on trying to talk to management about how and why they should go about this. Because ideally, what you want is that accommodations are available freely, that they don't even need to be requested. There's something called universal design that's mostly talked about in education, not so much in occupational settings, which is just design things as best you can to have as many different options available to people of how to go about things, and offer it to them freely without having to justify anything.
Yeah.
Because that whole process, like, what if you are self-identified ADHD and then you reveal and ask for an accommodation? What if they ask for an official doctor's diagnosis and then you got to go through? It's just a lot.
Yeah.
So ideally, you find a company like that. And if you are in a position to do this, which obviously is not always the case, I would discuss these things in the interview process before accepting a job. You want to know how they think and feel about this stuff before you sign on there. Again, if you're in a position to be able to be selective about where you work. If not, that's it. I mean, of course, I would always say be authentic, be open, because otherwise, if they are the kind of people who would not hire you because of having ADHD or being autistic or whatever thing, and you hide it from them long enough to get hired, well, now you're stuck in a position where you've got to spend the rest of your working career there worried about revealing it to them, because they wouldn't have hired you if they'd found out. They're not going to like it if they find out after either. But you got to do what you got to do, right? Sometimes we all have to take, well, maybe not all of us, but I know I certainly, and most people I know have had to take plenty of crap jobs with crap employers that you just have to survive, because that's what you got to do.
So maybe we'll talk a little bit about things that employers can do, and then things that you can do for yourself in the workplace to make things more manageable. So yeah,
that second piece, the things you can do for yourself, or that you can do with the aid of people whom you trust at your place of employment, that to me, when we're talking about workplace accommodations, that's the more important one to start with. Even though I think personally, like, my beliefs, my political viewpoint is that the onus should be on the employer, the people with the more resources. In practical terms, that's just not how it works all the time. And I don't want to give people the impression that just because it should be that way means that it is that way.
Yeah, sure.
So there are things you can do. That's why I wanted to designate official versus unofficial.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully your workplace has some process for accommodations.
Yeah, I know in my case, mine does, and I've had to make inquiries about that since becoming ill. And I've disclosed my ADHD to my employers, but I'm very lucky to work in a very supportive environment with a very supportive line manager. So
Yeah,
I know that's not the norm.
the larger your organization, the more likely that they have official policies in place to handle accommodations.
And they have the resources to put these accommodations in place. They have the money, they have the budget, they have access to,
Just kind of a truism that the larger an organization is, the more resources they put towards covering their own ass,
yeah,
own butt in terms of legal liability and so on. Doesn't always mean that those processes are very effective or, as just as they could or should be.
Mhm.
But the if you're trying to guess what the larger your organization, the more likely it is that there's some process and you can talk to someone in HR about it.
Sure.
Now,
so when I come, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say I think not just in terms of what you can do for yourself, but just generally talking in terms of unofficial accommodations, because there are many of these accommodations that you can talk to your direct supervisor or team lead or whatever. I'm going to use the word manager as like a stand-in for the person directly above you in the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
There are many of these things that you can talk with your manager about and put into place without ever using language like accommodations or disabilities or things like that. So if you're, in answer to that question, if you're nervous about revealing things, you can always just approach it that way first and just say things that people have said forever without clinical language attached to it. Things like, hey, I really do a lot better if I have some time to prepare. So if there's going to be a meeting where I'm expected to speak, please give me a day's notice on that, right? Even though that is something that we would think of or could think of as an accommodation, you don't have to phrase it that way. And that way, even if they don't comply with it or whatever, they doesn't necessitate that you say, because I X, I therefore need Y.
Yeah. I know that prior to my diagnosis, I would ask for things because I knew that I didn't work particularly well in an open plan space. So I asked to move to a smaller office. But I didn't know at the time that I had ADHD. But now that I do have ADHD, I could still ask for that without having to spell out, I have ADHD.
Yeah, that's why I'm talking so much about stuff that seems irrelevant, like the legal stuff at the beginning, because if you're doing it in terms of because I have ADHD or because I'm autistic or because I have some disability, therefore I'm requesting whatever, whether you mean to or not, what you're doing is you're obligating them. You're saying that they are legally obligated. You're giving them that impression anyway, that they are legally obligated to do this thing for you because you have some officially identified disability which requires them to do so.
Yeah.
So that's a last resort to me.
Yeah.
I feel like I want people to hide stuff because I don't, but you're not always safe to reveal things.
And some employers might see that as adversarial.
Right. It really in any interaction, even people who otherwise would be open to it or, respond well, if you approach an interaction with, I'm about to ask you something that you have to do for me. That's going to make most people less open to the request. And I know I'm saying this because the neurodivergent people that I am aware of and think of generally who would do it this way are not thinking of it that way. They're not intending to come and say, you must do this thing for me. It's mostly that they don't feel justified in making a request. So they're not saying you are obligated. They're saying I wouldn't ask for this except that kind of thing. And what I want to try and get across in this conversation is you don't need to justify a request that you make. I was about to make whatever. I'm just going to say it anyway. It's a little bit jokey and memey, but, gets the point across that, make requests with the confidence of a mediocre white man, right? Like, assume that you are entitled. In other words, if you ask something and the worst case response is that they say, no, you can't have it, then okay, go ask. What's the worst? They just say no. Yeah. If there's a worst case that's worse than that, then sure, put whatever thought and preparation and effort into it that that seems appropriate. But ask first. Don't explain first. Say, hey, I do better. That's your explanation. I do better with blank. I'm more comfortable with blank. It would help me if blank. I could be more productive if blank, whatever. Only if they come back and say, well, maybe we could do that, but help me understand exactly why that would be helpful to you. Do you need to bother going into any further explanation? Honestly, your manager doesn't really want to know that most of the time.
No.
I don't need a half an hour explanation of why you're going to be 10 minutes late to something. Just tell me you're going to be 10 minutes late. Cool. Done. We don't need to spend that time.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. I think when it comes to neurodivergent people, we feel sometimes like we're already on the back foot and we feel bad and we don't want to make other people feel obligated to do stuff, even if it would benefit them.
Well, in this case, it does, right?
Yeah.
Like your manager wants you to be as comfortable, as happy, as productive as possible. And I don't always care about, generally, I don't care about productivity as a main priority. But when we're talking about your place of employment, pretty guaranteed that your employer is going to care about your productivity.
Mm-hmm.
They want you to do well. They want you to have the things that you need. They do better when you do better, not only in terms of their life is easier because they're not having to deal with all these constant whatever things are popping up because you're struggling with something, right? Like if you over push and burn out and then have to call in sick the next day, I would much rather, even if I'm just a general, like hypothetical manager, not me personally, I would much rather you tell me in advance, like, hey, I have a bit of a headache today. If I could wear sunglasses or have the lights dimmed, that'll help me recover. Then you don't say that, push, and then tomorrow you can't come in at all. That makes my job a lot harder. So your manager should want information about you. Now, of course, a lot of managers are just petty tyrants, and that's a whole different thing. But that just means they're wrong, right? Like their lives would still be better and easier if you are better supported. That's why the work that I do on the corporate side of things is aimed at management, helping them to understand having a diverse team isn't something that you do because you have to, you're required to by law or to avoid allegations of ableism or racism or whatever. There is an inherent advantage to having a diverse team. The more diverse different backgrounds and perspectives of viewpoints and abilities you have, the more you cover, the more that if I miss it, you might catch it because we're different in that way. Now, the thing that must be acknowledged is that comes at a cost. The less you and I have in common, the more it costs us to communicate well with one another. To obviously, like an exaggerated extent would be that we don't speak the same language. It's going to be very costly for us to communicate, very inefficient, even though we'd have, between the two of us, much more information about language broadly because we speak two whole different ones. So you're wanting to balance that and prioritize communication. But that's me speaking to companies and how they should run things. Mm-hmm. For you, just ask for what you want. Tell them how you could be best supported. Your manager's job, theoretically, is to support you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Don't pre-justify. Don't wait until it's bad enough. Just say, hey, I'd like it if blank. Is that something we can do? So maybe they say no.
Yeah. So, yeah, sometimes employers might really want to accommodate, but cost might be an issue. So can we talk a little bit about things we can do for ourselves in the workplace? Like some easy adjustments or easy wins we can implement ourselves.
I mean, we'd have to give specific suggestions. We need some like specific scenarios.
Yeah. Okay, so where I work is an academic library. We'll use me. Mm-hmm. And
we can just put out like, here's a specific thing that I struggle with in the workplace and go from there. We don't necessarily need to know everything about the workplace.
Okay. So I would say that I have some auditory sensitivities, and sometimes I find a busy day can be very overwhelming, and I end up quite drained and distracted and probably don't do my best work when it's really loud and noisy. So But I'm at a desk where I have to be working with people all day. A lot of peopling, a lot of noise.
So I'll say with sensitivities generally, what you're going to want to do first, ideally, is to eliminate or keep to a minimum exposure to the type of data to which you're sensitive. Just staying out of noisy environments, for example, or leaving an environment when it becomes noisy, right? That's not always possible. So a second category of thing that you can do is put things in between you and the source of that stimuli. In the case of auditory sensitivity, obviously there's a lot of like easily thought of, hopefully pretty common references of things like earbuds or noise canceling headphones or things like that. But also there's a reason that people with auditory sensitivities also tend to like long hair and tend to decorate their homes with lots of very soft and sound absorbent material all over the place, lots of plants, not a lot of blank wall space and hard exposed floors. Nobody's thinking about it that way, but as soon as I pointed out, think in your head of yourself or the people that you know with an auditory sensitivity, think about how they dress and how they decorate their home. Does it involve a lot of very soft sound absorbent material and not a lot of very exposed hard sound reflective material, including even things like big cowl neck sweaters and scarves and just anything soft around this area?
Mm-hmm.
So limit your exposure to it, put something in between your brain and the stimuli. And then the last thing is to be able to, well, I should say there's a fourth thing that's a general, not specific. So the third thing would be the category of learning what to do with the information, because sensitivities are not deficiencies. Again, that's the point of neurodiversity. If we're talking about neurodiversity and all we're saying is it's a disability and it makes everything always harder, that's the medical model. That's not the neurodiversity paradigm. It is a disability, depending on what particular form of neurodiversity we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly what people are talking about, it's a disability. And it also makes you well suited to some tasks. And even the people who identify it as a deficiency only would still say that that's true. They would just say that the things that it makes you well suited for are bad things, right? Like you might be very well suited to scrolling on your phone for 4 hours at a time. You might think that's a bad thing, but you're well suited to it, right? You might be very well suited at coming up with and following several different tangents and rabbit holes in the course of a single conversation. So there are things you're well suited to, etc. If you have a sensitivity to a particular kind of data, that makes you well suited to some things. There's also a reason that people with auditory sensitivities will quite frequently be musicians or singers or really enjoy music or be very big into talking, for example. A lot of times it's even strange things like, as you might have noticed, right? People will talk about particular autistic, vocal stimming. I hum all the time, right? But also echolalia. I repeat certain sounds. And one that people will talk about sometimes, although I don't know if anyone's come up with a nice pithy way to say it, is people kind of absorbing and adopting the accents and speech cadences and patterns of speech of people that they're talking with.
Yeah.
Those are all things that are likely happening in someone who is also really stressed out by the particular thing with auditory sensitivity that tends to get people is multiple sources of auditory data. So like in a restaurant where there's a bunch of different conversations and clinking dishes and whatever, in a large open space where those sounds all get mixed together and it's hard to filter through for importance. So you can develop frameworks is what I'm trying to get at. That's the third thing is sensitivity. If you learn how to use that information, my metaphor for a framework is a Coinstar machine, which if you don't know what that is, it's if you get a bunch of change, like a big old bucket of change of all different kinds and whatever, take you forever to sort through. Well, there's a machine, you just dump it all in and it has and it sorts it all out and it gives you, here's a roll of quarters, here's your roll of, right, sorts it for you. So a framework is like a Coinstar machine. The auditory sensitivity means that you're receiving more auditory data than another person, theoretically, the average person, or than you receive of other types of data. It's just a relationship to your own experience. And when you don't know what to do with that data, it's overwhelming. It's like someone's just throwing a bunch of change at you and you're getting pelted with gross, dirty coins constantly and don't know what to do. When you do know what to do with that data, when you have frameworks to use that data, then it's like the Coinstar machine, and all that change becomes very useful, and you actually become more well suited to a task than other people that aren't that sensitive to the information. If you have a sensitivity, this is a theory of mine, so I can't say always, but this is my theory. I would encourage you to check, because the brain is adaptable. If you are sensitive to a particular type of data, that means that most of the time, in a large percentage of the cases in which you are receiving types of that data is useful to you. And it's actually, even though subjectively it's going to seem like it's constantly a problem, that in reality it's rarely a problem, but we notice the times when it's a problem more. So like people will say this all the time, I'm an overthinker. I overthink everything. No, 99% of the time you think about something and resolve it and move forward. But when you do that, it's fast and you don't notice it. It's only when something comes up and you try to think about it to resolve it and you can't. So you think about it more and it still doesn't resolve and you go on and on. Well, that takes up a disproportionate amount of your time and energy. You focus on it and you notice it. And then you say, why do I overthink everything? No, thinking is really useful for you, except in rare circumstances. But those rare circumstances cause big problems. So those are the three categories. Limit your exposure to the data, put something between your brain and the source of the stimuli, and develop frameworks to be able to utilize that data.
I really like that, because it reframes it and it moves away from the deficit model. You thinking about how these things can actually be harnessed and be strengths in the workplace and elsewhere.
Yeah,
really like this.
Which again reinforces why you shouldn't need to justify requesting an accommodation based on your own sense of discomfort or stress or illness or whatever. That it means if you're supported, you'll be exceptionally well suited for whatever thing you are well suited to when supported correctly.
Yeah. So you could go to your boss and say, I will do better if, or I work better when.
Give me a week's notice before I've got to talk in front of a group, and I will crush it and I'll be amazing at it. Tell me I have to talk in front of a group with no notice at all, and I will be a train wreck. That's just what it is. And now it's bad management on your part if you put me in that position. Like, I have given you the information you need as a manager to know how to utilize me and how I can help you in your concerns. Mm-hmm. I've told you what will happen the other. It's kind of like, if an employee came to you and said they were terrified of small dark spaces, and then you assign them to work in a tiny closed closet, like, what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah, you're not going to get the best out of them.
Right. And on the flip side, if they say that they don't like enclosed spaces because they're very physically oriented and they like to move their body and have open space around them, and you assign them to a task that involves that, they're probably going to do really well at that. So think of this as giving your manager information on how to best get the results he or she wants out of your work.
Yeah, I really like this. We do have a longish question. So I'm going to read it. And it's just stop me at any point if you need me to reiterate anything. Okay. So the question is, what can you do when you know how you work best, but it's not possible in the current job circumstances? How do you get through and do the job anyway? So this is somebody who knows that they work best when they're collaborating with others. So when they're in a team scenario, they prefer even sitting with somebody, even for up to 6 or 8 hours a day, so they can collaborate and talk through things with them. I would be a bit like this too. And they like to be supervised or be supervised by them rather than just doing it on their own. But with the field they're in, collaboration is really only about 5% of their current work day. They really like the field they're working in, so they don't want to leave this area of work. They really like their career, and they want to stay here with this employer and in this field. So,
okay. Well, so one thing I'll mention quickly because it's relevant here, but I also mentioned it in that last question. That the fourth thing to pay attention to is not necessarily a specific accommodation. There's something called stress load theory, which effectively just says what we've said in a lot of other ways, but it's good to hang it on particular language, that stress is you paying a particular cost. And the specific source of that stress doesn't mean that the resource you're using to pay the cost comes from some extra different pool. In other words, if I'm stressed about getting an assignment in, and I'm stressed because my child is sick, and I'm stressed because there's a bunch of noise going on around me, that's all pulling from the same source of stress. So if there is some stressful stuff that I just have no way around and have to deal with, one thing that I always want to be able to look at is, sure, look at whether in case of sensitivities, those three categories, or stuff that we're about to talk about here, look at specific things you can do to diminish the amount of stress that you have to deal with for that thing. But if you can't make it any less, then you got to look at the rest of your life and say, what other things can I diminish the amount of stress I'm dealing with those things? And, or both, what can I do to replenish those resources that are being drawn on by the stress outside of this area? So how do I conserve as much of it as possible, spend as little of it as possible elsewhere? And how do I regenerate and store and conserve as much of it as possible elsewhere? Because there are, circumstances in which, even though we could always technically say you technically have a choice because you could get fired and live on the street and blah, 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 just for practical purposes, you've run out of other choices. This is why, to me, and this is where I would go with this particular question. Well, first I'll give this practical answer. The very beginning, it is not possible, right? What do you do when you're how you work best, but you're in a condition, a context, I can't remember the specific word, a context in which it's not possible. I really, really want to be thorough about that. It's not possible. Sometimes it is not possible, and I'm not making any assumptions about the particular person who asked this specific question, but some common examples of things where people think it's not possible without doing due diligence is some stuff that we've already talked about. I can't ask my boss for X, Y, or Z. Are you sure about that? What is it? Are you doing that neurodivergent thing of making guesses about how they'll respond, and then forgetting that your guess about how they'll respond, even if it is accurate or likely, or you have reason to think that might be how they respond, we sometimes forget that we didn't actually go through that process. We just assume that we get so used to being good at making these reads or being safe by just going with, even if it's the 50-50 chance, the bad one's real bad, so I'll just be safe and just assume I'm not going to do it. We tend to lose track sometimes of the fact that we didn't actually talk to anybody or feel it out in any way or explore what possibility. Sometimes we just are given, here's your job, and we just have an assumption that means that they would not accept any other version of this job.
Yeah.
When it doesn't always mean that. Stuff like that. But assuming that it is not possible, and I would always encourage people to explore that, then we might be in a place where we're dealing with that stress load theory, and that's where I want to go talk about the accomplishment equation stuff. Cost and value. Mm-hmm. Your field, your job, your place of work, the person asking this question, all those things contain a lot of value for you, very clearly. I don't want to change what I'm doing or who I'm doing it with, et cetera, et cetera. Having to work in this way is the cost, part of the cost you are paying in order to access that value. If there really is no possibility of doing it any differently, then you have to conceptualize it that way. Either it's something that is potentially changeable, in which case let's go down exploring that path, or it is not potentially changeable, in which case you just have to say, this is a cost. This is what it costs me, part of what it costs me. And you have to continue to evaluate and make sure that the costs and the value stay in balance, and rely on that stress load theory approach, right? To make sure that you are able to pay that cost. It would be better if I can collaborate means it is worse that I can't collaborate. And there are specific ways and specific reasons that it would be better or preferable. And there are specific ways and reasons that it is undesirable to not collaborate. What are those specific things? Are there things that you can do to try and address that stuff? So I'm very similar. Obviously, I think out loud. I love talking with people. I particularly have a problem with, I'm I am aware that even though I'm just brainstorming and saying ideas that pop into my head, I have a way of talking and appearing, and people regard me as an expert who knows what they're talking about. I'm in a position of power with running my own. So I have a particular problem with I'm trying to brainstorm with people and everyone's thinking that I'm giving them stuff that I've thought through and decided, and therefore not like feedback and just brainstorming with me. Or vice versa. Sometimes I'll put something out there as a like, would you be interested in this? And they responding to it as a, I think you should do this. Kind of, like, so we all have our own things that get in the way. You work around it. Can you get some of what you need from that collaboration? Is some of it just social needs, right? Like it's not necessarily about collaborating through the work. You just need time with people to talk through people, in which case you look at getting it outside of that work or within that work in a social context, not, sitting at a bench. If it is related to the productivity, I mean, you can look at things like body doubling and just getting somebody else on a Zoom call in front of you while you do your work and talk things through with them. In programming, there's a particular technique they call rubber duck decoding. I think is what they call it. Debugging, rubber duck debugging. Yeah. It's called that because programmers will sometimes keep a rubber duck at their workspace, and when they're struggling to work through a problem, they'll explain it to the rubber duck. And so, like what I'm talking about, I think as I talk, if you just start explaining it to an entity that isn't even there, maybe it's just about being verbal. Side note, not totally side note relevant here. The idea that talking to yourself is crazy, makes you a crazy person, I have no idea where that thought even came from. Like, I honestly don't know what it is that someone was looking at to draw the conclusion that talking to yourself is crazy. We have good evidence, not only research-based evidence, but self-evident evidence that when we say something out loud, we remember it better. We think through it more. There's all kinds of benefits to speaking your thoughts out loud, even to yourself. Do you have any idea? I'm genuinely curious why people got the impression that speaking out loud to yourself or with no one else around is crazy.
I have no idea. No. And I think we all do it. Most of us do it. Yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, everyone, at least on occasion, is going to say something like, oh, shoot, which is just processing a thought out loud.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, right. Like research shows, for example, that when you stub your toe and you swear, your pain tolerance increases.
Right.
There is obviously utilizing your voice to whatever extent, communicating in whatever way that you do, has some inherent benefit for humans.
I have resolved so many arguments in the shower, just talking it out.
Especially with neurodivergent people, if you're having one of those fights in your head or like trying to predict how other people will respond, just do it out loud.
Yeah.
Like the number of times that someone will say, okay, but what about, oh, wait, nope, I just answered my own question. Like just starting saying it out loud. So this is actually an executive functioning thing. Language is one of those things that people don't ever think about when it comes to executive functioning, but is very core in terms of executive functioning. Taking a concept and encapsulating it in language, not just abstract conceptualization, which, mostly, especially our highest level thoughts are in language, but we do kind of have vibes and feelings and things, having to go through the process of allocating that into symbolic, representational symbols, symbolic symbols. Putting it into language is a process. And going through that process, regardless of whether someone else is around to hear it, is beneficial, or at least potentially beneficial. Not to mention, especially if you have an auditory sensitivity, that likely means that you process audible speech much more deeply, and therefore meaning you have much more practice over the course of your life dealing with information that you get through audible speech than you do from written speech or from conceptualization. So speaking it out loud activates your tactile senses, kinesthetic senses, your auditory senses. It's a completely different thing. So a little bit of extra time on a brief side note there, but get rid of the idea that talking to yourself out loud is crazy. And this is one of those things that people might say, well, but I can't do that at work because people around me, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is one of those things where you can just say, you don't have to justify, you don't have to say, because I have ADHD, because I am autistic, I need to talk to myself out loud. You just say, hey, you know what? It's a lot easier for me to work through things if I talk through them out loud. So I talk to myself sometimes.
Yeah.
If that bothers you, let me know. Right?
Yeah.
That's part of why I mentioned the rubber duck programming. I want you to understand it's so common that there's a term for it in a particular field. You are not weird for processing in that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the entire reason collaboration works, but to whatever element that is, you can do stuff there.
Yeah. My partner is a software developer. I know nothing about that field at all, but he processes everything out loud with me, and I do the same with him. With completely different career paths. It doesn't matter. It helps to talk it out. So now when we need to do that, we'll say, do you need to rubber duck it?
You know, I have a little framework that I use for my therapists and coaches when I train them that I'll share here to tell the difference between what I call communication versus verbal processing versus rambling, because people will get confused. You know, they'll say I'm verbal processing, or they're verbally processing, but maybe they're rambling, or maybe it's both, whatever. So here's the difference to me. Communication, I define as anything one person does with the intent of modifying the way some other person or people think, feel, or behave. I'm saying or doing whatever it is that I'm saying or doing in order to impact you by sharing information with you, by whatever. And it doesn't mean I'm trying to manipulate you. If I say, hey, then I'm just trying to impact your thoughts by making sure that you're aware of the fact that I am here, for example, right? Verbal processing is the rubber ducking that we've been talking about. That it might be more beneficial if I have another person there, especially for those of us, and many neurodivergent people are this, who have a sensitivity to social data. Having another person to read and see their responses to things, what's boring, what's interesting, what's gross, whatever, can be additionally helpful. But that the point isn't that I'm trying to impact you. The point is that I am trying to think through something. I'm trying to move my understanding from one place to another place. I'm stuck or moving forward. I want to get going. That's the point of verbal processing. Rambling is when I feel like I'm supposed to say something, but I don't know what I'm supposed to say. So I'm just saying stuff. The most common version of that would be I'm uncomfortable with silence. Usually I'm uncomfortable with silence. It's just saying, when it's silent, I think that means that I'm supposed to be saying something. And so I start saying something. So if I'm communicating with you, if someone is communicating with you, they're paying attention to your responses and how you're hearing and being impacted by what they're saying. If they're verbally processing with you, which arguing is a particular weird thing in between these two things, but if they're verbally processing with you, they're paying more attention to their own thoughts. Mm-hmm. This, again, is a distinction between a very common neurodivergent experience of you've gone through something and now I am attempting to relate to you by telling you about something from my own life. If I'm focused on you and how you're feeling, then doing that is an attempt to communicate with you. If I am no longer paying attention to you, it just sparked a memory for me and now I want to share my memory regardless of what's going on with you, then that's verbally processing, which is fine, but also means that they are not really responding to what you're saying, right? There are differences between these things. Mm-hmm. And if I'm rambling, I'm neither listening to you nor to myself. You'll be able to know if you're rambling if you stop yourself and you can't remember what the hell you were just saying at all. I don't mean like every word. I mean like I have no idea what I'm saying right now.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to be able to explain that because there are times when you're having a conversation and they're not. They're verbally processing, and that's not great. And there are times where verbally processing is fine and whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what's prompted all that, but yeah, process verbally, that's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, that's when my partner and I do the rubber ducking thing, that we're definitely in verbal processing mode, and we both know it. So neither of us feels like put out by the fact that the other person is just talking it through.
additional like little tip with that verbal processing: develop new language.
Mm.
Memory and perception is all gated through language. So as you're working through thoughts, even in your head too, just when you think of something new, attach it to some new symbolic representation. The most efficient way of doing that is to use language that you don't usually use, but that is connected, that you're aware of, right? Like there's a reason that I split it into verbal processing, rambling, and communication, right? That's not words that we use all the time and have very strong associations with. Or, or if you're going to do that, make sure that you're using the word that has a strong association to mean the thing to which it is strongly associated. Just use language, use new language. You'll remember everything better.
Yeah.
It's part of the reason that singing things helps remember. Anyway, got on a lot of specific things there.
Yeah. So just to come back to that question from this client. So we mentioned body doubling as a potential solution. So that's a really good one for verbal processing. So I have been involved with body doubling groups in the past, and people from completely different fields come together and just work together on Zoom. And during the breaks, we might talk out a problem we're having or something we're trying to work through. And just, yeah, as you say, verbal processing, just the process of talking it out can help us solve the problem, even if we're not working with people that are in our field. For this client, I'm wondering if they need to be working with somebody in their field, if there's a way they can get that input from outside of their workplace, like
Again,
maybe join
if I
professional.
was speaking to this person, I'd ask all kinds of clarifying questions because a lot of it depends. If what they're saying is, I need somebody else with knowledge of the situation to be able to get, respond to my thoughts, which would be if I'm working at a very complex and high level and wanting to work quickly, then I need somebody else who shares this knowledge. But if I'm just generally wanting, well, verbal processing, like we said, could be a rubber duck. But if it is about, needing feedback, the Eli 5, explain it like I'm 5 thing, forcing yourself to use language that doesn't include your technical jargon that someone else in your field would share is often a way to be able to shake things up and help you to solve your problem. So depending on the issue and depending on what you do and what use you find in this stuff, sometimes it's more beneficial to talk to somebody outside of your field than in it. Jargon gets a bad rap, but it exists for a reason. It's very specialized language, and therefore only very few people know it because it's specialized. It's only useful in very particular situations. But in the situations in which it's useful, it is much more useful to have access to that jargon. It allows you to capture some very complex and convey some very complex thoughts in a very small way and be very specific while you're doing so. The difference between this and that, right? Now, it gets talked about as though, oh, well, that person's just trying to sound smart because by using words I don't know. That's some bullcrap from our culture about intelligence and particularly vocabulary and whatever, that if you don't know a word, that means you're dumb. And therefore, if someone else uses a word you don't know, they're trying to make you feel dumb, which means they're trying to make it seem like they're smart. People do that. Sure, that happens. Mm-hmm. That's not the jargon's fault. So but with all language, we encode meaning into the language we develop. And jargon is very complex. It's very niche and specific. By its nature, it contains a lot of information in a very small thing, which means the likelihood that I have encoded that differently than other people goes up. That when I use a piece of jargon, I guess I should even explain what jargon just means what I've been saying to me. It's like it's a particular word or phrase that is uniquely suited for a particular role or set of tasks or profession that outside of that context doesn't mean much. So it is, because it's so complicated. Well, I'm trying to think of like a specific, okay. In therapy, for example, unconditional positive regard would be a piece of jargon. It's not something that means something to most people, but it's meaningful and relevant and good to be able to use that to convey some things. But, neurodiversity, that's a better example. Neurodiversity is jargon. It's a very complex thing. Now, honestly, like we talked about, the vast majority of people who use the phrase neurodiversity are actually talking about the medical model, but they're just trying to be polite and inoffensive in the way that they're discussing it, which is better. I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying it's not what neurodiversity was originally intended to mean. So that's a great example of a piece of jargon where, because there is a subtle difference between the neurodiversity paradigm that we're all different and that that's natural and whatever, versus this medical model in disguise of we're all different and that's okay, even though some of us are different in bad ways, just adds that little piece, right? If you're using jargon, there's a good chance, or at least a higher than normal chance, that there's something in there. So that's why the explaining it like I'm five thing can really help. It forces you to back up to first principles and explain something in a way that makes you actually look at it. And as soon as you say it like you're explaining to someone who's five, you're like, oh, of course, because some little piece gets revealed to you.
Yeah.
Especially in technical and academic fields where jargon is rewarded independent of its actual value. There are fields where, yes, it has value, but also part of it, another piece of jargon here, is just shibboleth. It's a shibboleth meaning a word or phrase or a particular sign that shows people that you are part of the in-group of some particular in-group. So there is jargon that is just code. That's just saying, see, I'm using this word. That means that I'm part of this group. And that, especially in technical and academic fields, and especially in like corporate, like non-specific, just vague corporate, there's a lot of corpo speak, corporate jargon that doesn't mean anything. It's just, we want to synergize our results for best outcome and make sure we're, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Open the kimono here that nobody knows what they're saying. They're just saying code words.
So there could be a way for this person to talk through their work with somebody without having it to be somebody that's in the office with them.
Yeah. Depending on, like, either by rubber ducking it or by talking to somebody outside of their field, a spouse or a friend or whatever at some other point. Also attending conferences and, depending on the field, making professional contacts and networks with people who are in your field, but outside of there's a reason that all the old, like, scientists and philosophers and artists had, letter writing relationships with each other across the continent. Sometimes it is helpful to be able to talk to somebody else and you're not going to be working with them. And so you'd start up an email relationship and you just send ideas back and forth, or a group chat or whatever. Some other possible things, and I'm going to speed through some things here, so I won't give all my reasoning about why these might possibly be helpful, but I got to get going. Some other possible things are physical movement might help this person, that when you're getting stuck or bored or whatever, just getting up and moving. One very likely thing is allow yourself this. I'm going to guess that this person would say that they struggle with getting distracted. They have a hard time focusing. Could be completely wrong. But if that's the case, especially, don't think of it as a distraction anymore. There's only so much you can do on a particular thing before the return on investment of continued thinking and focus on the thing just isn't very great. And your brain will naturally try to get your attention shifted elsewhere for reasons. It doesn't just go any random place. It goes to something else specifically for reasons that you may not always know and you don't have to understand. And then you might come back later with, allow yourself to get distracted. It might be sometimes that just having another person there is a pro-social way to enable that distraction, because if I chat with my buddy about whatever, then that's kind of how I get myself to not stay super ultra focused on one thing and getting stuck. So following distractions, generally physical movement, building in breaks, building into your day when you have time and availability, personal and unrelated conversations. Get on the phone. I tell my therapists, not all of them, but some of them especially are very oriented socially in certain ways, that when you have breaks, schedule phone calls with your friends. Hey, I'm free from such time to such time. Can we just chat for an hour? This might be really problematic depending on what other things the person struggles with, but juggling a bunch of different projects at once to be able to cycle through this to this to this to this, or when I get stuck here, I can move to this other project instead of trying to do one. Really, very likely that something will be helpful here is clarifying what exactly the criteria that you've been asked to achieve is. that there's a good chance that part of being stuck is you get told do X, Y, or Z, you start doing X, Y, or Z, but in the process of that, you come to something that, well, I don't know which one they meant, because doing it this way might be X, but doing this way might be X. Go back and clarify. That's very commonly a place people get stuck. Oh, I don't know how to do this, and I can't ask because that will reveal I don't know how to do this. Again, your manager, if they are any good at their job at all, which hopefully theoretically they are, I would much rather that you come to me and say, hey, I'm not clear on this thing, and I can clear it up for you very quickly, and we can move forward, than you spend a day, 2, a week, and have 5 panic attacks and waste all your time and energy trying to figure it out because you don't want to reveal to me. Your manager is worried that they weren't clear. If they're a jerk, when you come and get clarification from them, they're being a jerk because they are worried that they weren't clear, and now you've made it seem like, well, maybe they weren't, and they've got to make it your fault because otherwise they're too uncomfortable with the fact that they might have been unclear. But again, if they're any kind of decent person or manager, when you come back and ask for clarity, it'll be a relief. Oh, I didn't realize that wasn't clear. Thank you for pointing that out to me. Let me clarify. I'm so glad you told me. They might not say it that way, but that's how they should react. A bunch of other ideas, but I'm running late. I gotta get going. Let's say something to get wrapping up.
This has been really good, really useful. I will put some of the links to some of the stuff we've talked about on the YouTube video when it goes out on Wednesday. So this recording will go out again on Wednesday on YouTube for anybody who wants to catch up, and I'll add some links to things like the rubber duck debugging method and things like that in the YouTube blurb, so you'll be able to read a bit more about that if you're interested.
I know I'm the one that's wanting to wrap us up, but I want to add one thing real quick, just because this commonly comes up, and is finding replacement stems or fidgets. If you fidget, that's a stem, right? Like everybody stems. We don't call it that, but this is stemming, this is stemming, this is stemming. It's all, you have some intense internal experience, whether it's nerves, fear, tiredness, excitement, whatever, and you do something that draws your attention back to the environment in some way. You go in your car and scream, you play loud music, whatever. Your stems might be things that you think are weird, or that give you, that you're worried might give other people an impression of you that you don't want them to have. So like a very common one, I did this for a reason. People, this will be their stem, playing, chewing, whatever. But they think, oh, that makes me seem nervous or unprofessional, so I can't do it in the workplace. Find another stem that you can replace it with. And I'll just mention very briefly, it's super sexist that this is considered to be nervous, but this is considered to be pensive, because it's the same darn thing. So with this particular question too, it's quite likely that part of what's helpful about talking to another person is that it is in some ways stimming, either the act itself of communicating with someone, or that there are certain mannerisms or habits or things in which you engage during conversation that are stimming, that you might never have identified that way because it's all looped under, I like talking with people and collaborating with people. So you can investigate it on that level too and see, is there something specifically about that? I guess a lot of this is really just trying to break down what potential elements of collaborating with someone are useful to you, and then seeing if you can replicate those individual elements in some other way rather than doing the one thing that packages them all together, since that's not an option. Mm-hmm. Yeah, replacement stems. I also, just kind of talking to your coworkers and explaining your stems can be helpful. But, I listen to music and that's whatever, but I'm not allowed to. Well, I find something else that I can do that maybe accomplishes the same thing.
Yeah, I know when I did once reveal some stems to a group I was working with, somebody came back to me and said, oh, I knit during every meeting, and that's the only way that I can get through it. And it didn't have to be because they were neurodivergent. It was just, this is what I do to get through a meeting, and it's okay.
Like in the American version of The Office, because I haven't watched the British version, which I feel like I probably shouldn't admit, but it's true. Stan Hudson is a character who sits in every meeting doing crosswords and looking down. And the whole joke is that he supposedly doesn't care and is not paying attention, but he will, when they direct questions at him, he'll respond. He'll jump like. Is it possible that that is based on an archetype of a person who is uncomfortable with eye contact and sensitive to social data, but having something, a stem that allows me to divert some of my attention is actually what frees me up to engage with? Just saying, these things exist for a reason.
for a reason. Yeah.
I really got to go. I'm so sorry. I keep
Okay.
adding.
No, I'm glad we had this time this week, and it's been really interesting. And next week we will talk about accommodations in education. So more of the same next week.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to it already. Take care.
Thanks, Marie.